Hello, this is Laurence Galian, your host of The Place Inside. Something happened about 2,000 years ago. An object was observed racing across the sky, making a maneuver no comet could make. It was observed by astronomers around the world, from Vietnam to India, all the way to Mexico. Around that same time, a city is seeded that grows at an incredible rate to dominate all of Mesoamerica. The city is dominated by a god said to have descended from the heavens. Someone or something brought the knowledge to build immense pyramids, among the largest in the world, to a culture that had not built anything higher than the roofs of their mud huts. The ancient peoples of Mesoamerica, the Mayans, Aztecs, and all the others, shared gods and legends, including Quetzalcoatl. The Mayans called him Kukulkan. It's said he invented the calendar, the one that ends on the winter solstice, December 21st, 2012. To those ancient people, the world was not just a threatening place, but was one that changed and shifted. We believe that the world we were born into is the only world that has ever existed. That's not true at all. Repeatedly, over the eons, world-shattering calamities have wiped out the major life forms on Earth, not just the dinosaurs, but other mass extinctions. The ancient Mayans and Aztecs had a more realistic view of history. They realized that the world around them was just the latest in a series of worlds that had previously existed. Each of the previous worlds fell to shattering, cataclysmic events. What we would call hits from planet-killing asteroids, earthquakes, ice ages, fire, and flood, but what they thought of as the violent whims of the gods. They believed civilizations lost their way and were wiped out by angry gods. The gods of ancient Mexico, especially the Aztecs, were nourished with human blood. It gave the sun god the strength to rise each day, the rain god the strength to water the earth, and the war god the strength to win battles. So the gods made a covenant with mankind. Feed us blood and we will give you rain and sunshine for a good harvest, and strength and courage for victory in war. There were a group of people, we are familiar with the term werewolves. In the ancient time of the Aztecs, there were jaguars. They were jaguars because they also drank their victims' blood. Legends of shape-changing beasts exist all over the world. European werewolves, African leopard men, tiger men in India. In Mexico, it's jaguars because the beasts have a special place in the lore of Latin America. They're the only great roaring cats in the Americas. Creatures of dangerous grace and savage power, but at least 300 or 400 pounds. Not exactly something you would want to pet. The indigenous peoples have always feared and revered them. The word jaguar comes from their word Jaguar, he who kills with one leap. There was something called the cult of the jaguar, and they nearly threw the Spaniards out of Mexico. Legend has it that they were shape changers who could transform into jaguars, hideous creatures called narwhals. The king's men finally put an end to the cult with a hangman's noose, but the legend of narwhals didn't die in the jungles of Mexico, where modern culture is still barely felt even today. So this was the cult of the jaguar, a secret society that arose specifically to drive out the invaders after the Spanish conquest. The members dressed as jaguars, prowled at night, stalking and murdering the Spaniards. At the time of Christ, Teotihuacan was the largest city in the Western Hemisphere, the center of a powerful empire, and a metropolis that rivaled ancient Rome in size. Today it is Mexico's biggest tourist attraction. It lies 30 miles northeast of Mexico City. The ruins of the ancient city had two magnificent pyramids the Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon. In our last podcast, you could see a photo of me taken in the 90s standing on what is called the Avenue of the Dead, Avenida de los Muertos, and you can see the Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon behind me. I have climbed both of these pyramids. The pyramid dedicated to the sun god was only a hair smaller than the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt. The Aztecs were hated by the other tribes and peoples in the area because the Aztecs were bloodthirsty and their ways were not the ways of the other indigenous peoples. It's also very mysterious why the largest city ever built on the American continent before Columbus was abandoned. All of the civilizations that rose afterwards in Mesoamerica, the Mayans, Toltecs, and others, mimicked the structures they found here in building their own temples and pyramids, but never created ones this large. And none of them ever tried to populate the deserted city, Teotihuacan. I'm going to tell you something that is quite a secret, that many people are told when they come here to Mexico that the Aztecs built the pyramids, the Pyramid of the Sun and Moon, in Teotihuacan. The fact is that a civilization unknown to the Aztecs built Teotihuacan and the Great Pyramids. I am revealing a great mystery here to you. The Aztecs themselves were afraid of Teotihuacan. They were called the stormtroopers of ancient Mexico. They feared the ghost city after the people of Teotihuacan mysteriously disappeared. They sensed dark magic at the huge pyramids and temples along the Grand Boulevard, which I've mentioned to you, that's called the Avenue of the Dead. The main god and the legendary builder of the city was said to be particularly bloodthirsty. Now, Teotihuacan is often just abbreviated as Teo, but the hypothesis is that this great civilization that suddenly arose at Teo and disappeared as suddenly and mysteriously was created by a being of superior intelligence, and that being most likely was a visitor from beyond. Its high state of civilization suddenly appeared in a region of the world isolated from the march of progress. This was a great city. In thousands of years, nothing to compare came about on the entire continent. It ruled an enormous empire and built world-class edifices. What occurred at Teotihuacan was a sudden explosion of progress and the rise of an empire with a territory larger than that of Western Europe. Even more astonishing is that the region basically relied upon a single crop, corn, and had no beasts of burden. No horses, no mules, no donkeys, oxen, cattle. Look at the Pyramid of the Sun. As high as a 20-story building, and if it were hollow, the Houston Astrodome could fit inside it. It's bigger than 2 of Egypt's 3 biggest pyramids, and the city around it went for miles in every direction and ruled an empire that extended 2,000 miles. Ancient Mexicans and ancient Egyptians who lived halfway around the world from each other and never could have interacted had amazing similarities. Both worshipped feathered serpent deities, built the largest pyramids on earth, used hieroglyphics as their writing system, invented paper, developed sophisticated mathematics and astronomy, and had a 365-day calendar. While ancient Egypt has been studied extensively for centuries, the wonders of ancient Mexico have been barely scratched, and for a scientist to even suggest the incredible similarities were anything but a pure coincidence would subject the scientist to the most intense ridicule. A significant event occurred in the 1st century around the time of Christ, shortly before Teo rose to become the greatest city of the Americas. a fiery object was seen flying across the sky from east to west. Astronomers in China, India, and Rome recorded the event as a comet, but noted that it was much brighter and appeared closer to Earth than any comet seen before. Even more perplexing was a claim that the object changed course. It didn't take much for ancient people to decide that this was a god racing around the world in a fiery chariot. Now, interestingly, there was a creature associated very much with Teotihuacan, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. The creature in depictions of him appears grotesque, with the head of a giant snake, the jaws of a shark, and the plumes of a tropical bird. It's called an archaeobeast, an ancient supernatural spirit or preternatural beast, usually associated with an archaeological site. Cultures all over the world have them. Quetzalcoatl is just more ferocious looking than the others. Now, we don't know exactly what he looked like, but Teotihuacan was ruled by a god king by the name of Quetzalcoatl. This is an historical fact. We don't know whether there was a single king with that name or a series of them using the name. As you recall, in previous podcasts we have spoken about beings such as Merlin, and that Merlin was a title and not just limited to one human being. So that could have been the case with Quetzalcoatl. The legend was that he was a frightful creature, a feathered serpent that flew in. The ancient Mexicans identified Quetzalcoatl with the evening star, a flaming object in the sky. Like the biblical Genesis, the legend of him is a creation story in which he creates humans. Descending from the sky, he found a deserted world in which everyone had died. He gathered the bones of the dead and anointed them with his own blood, so that they rose back to life. He, by the way, is the bloodthirsty gentleman who instituted the blood covenant. Now, close to Teotihuacan is another city named Cuicuilco. If you ask most Mexicans living today about Cuicuilco and where it exists, they do not know. They do not even know that this pyramid exists right in the middle of the city, the Distrito Federal, Mexico City. This is a round pyramid, and it is speculated that its existence goes back at least 10,000 years. Research says that probably Cuicuilco was destroyed by fire and brimstone, probably from a volcano nearby, or perhaps it was destroyed by the arrival of the visitor Quetzalcoatl. Many people were killed, and the city of Cuicuilco was abandoned. The survivors built a new city, Teotihuacan. Bottom line, Quetzalcoatl comes down in his spaceship and makes a people build a new city after destroying theirs, Cuicuilco. Now, the story of a visitor from space building a city really isn't any harder to believe than the biblical tale of a supernatural being creating the world in 6 days, or a Darwinian theory that this incredible miracle we call life started with the accidental mixing of chemicals in a primeval seed. Now, we're going to get around to talking about the famous Yahweh and his hijinks in the Bible. Many people put down and disregard the peoples of Mesoamerica because of this quote-unquote blood covenant, and they describe them as backwards people. Well, it wasn't any more barbaric than the Romans putting thousands of men, women, and children to death in the arena, often letting them be ripped to pieces by wild animals as the crowds cheered, or the Inquisition burning people at the stake, or perhaps the French French executioners holding up the quote-unquote talking heads of people guillotined. Then there's the murder of 6 million Jews. So can we really say that the Mesoamericans were brutish, far behind our lofty Western civilization? The history of humanity is a chronicle of inhumanity. In the pre-Columbian world, it was thought of as a matter of survival. The people believed that there were constant power struggles in the form of war and chaos among the gods. Now, this is not different than what you read in the Mahabharata. But the Mesoamericans believed that it was up to humanity to maintain order in the cosmos, and that order could be maintained only by pacifying the gods with bloody sacrifices. Again, sounds a little bit like Yahweh, doesn't it? Now, unfortunately, the people who did the reconstruction of the Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon at Teotihuacan did not do a very good job of it. They were rushed to complete it before some world exposition, I believe in the early 1900s. And researchers previously had found tunnels under the site. Also, another problem with Mexico is money for archaeological research. Sadly, there is not enough money to research all the sites in Mexico. Honestly, you would not believe how many sites still exist, enormous, incredible temples and sites that are still encrusted with the jungle and have never been uncovered. We need people to donate money. We need to generate the excitement to get financing for the archaeologists to uncover these most incredible temples and the codices, the information that lies within them, great wisdom that has been lost to humankind but is there now, just awaiting discovery. So, the researchers previously did find tunnels under the site, but because of the rush to complete the reconstruction and the fact that there has never been the money necessary to do the excavation to study them, they were not explored. It has always been suspected that they run all the way to a mountain that's very near Teotihuacan. Tales of the feathered serpent often referred to an underground palace or tomb in the mountains, but without clues as to where it was located. Now, back in the 1500s, a scientist sent by Philip II of Spain to research Teo reported a story of a tunnel that ran to an underground palace in the mountains north of the city. This scientist also reported having found the bones of people and beasts over 15 feet tall in the Teotihuacan area. That report takes on a stranger hue when it's matched up with the Aztec legend that Teotihuacan was built by giants. As you know, there have been and are many alien UFO sightings in Mexico. They've had some amazing sightings in Mexico City and by the Mexican Air Force. Apparently, the sightings have made Air Force pilots here true believers in the UFO phenomenon. But there was one at Teo. Back in the 1920s, an American archaeologist reported his team was visited by a UFO when they were examining the Teotihuacan ruins. Lewis Spence, in his book The Magic and Mysteries of Mexico, written in 1930, wrote, "A great lesson is to be learned from old Mexico. For our own world is demon-haunted. The powers and principalities of black magic beset it as never before. Evil is tireless. All evil works through a magic of its own, a black magic which expresses itself in forms so numerous and so protean that it is frequently indistinguishable from goodness and beauty. Every year there is a celebration to Our Lady of Guadalupe, the appearance of what is said to be Mary, the Mother of God, in Mexico. And there is a great church temple built where she appeared, and the actual cloak is displayed in which her image miraculously appeared. Now, I have walked past this image several times. I must tell you, the first time that I walked past it, I did not expect to feel anything. I just thought that I would walk past some kind of religious image or icon, and that would be it. But to tell you the truth, when I walked past it, I was overcome with emotion, such intense emotion. And after that, at least on 3 more occasions, I have had the opportunity to see this image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, and each time the experience becomes more intense. But not only that, on each December, when they have this great feast, the whole area, and it's an immense area surrounding this church, fills up with the indigenous peoples coming from all over Mexico, dressed in their ceremonial garb. It is absolutely incredible, a sight that you all need to see. Thousands of tribes, all in their ancient, beautiful, magnificent tribal costumes and gear, are appearing and doing the ancient sacred dances with their drums and music. It is a cacophony of ecstasy and beauty and color and movement taking place everywhere you turn your face. It is amazing, and people are coming by the millions in every direction. It is something you have to see in person to believe. But what I want to point out here is that the indigenous peoples of Mexico are still very much alive and still very much functioning in the world as a spiritual force. You will see men in their 50s, 60s, 70s, even 80s, dancing for 2-3 days non-stop. It is unbelievable. Yes, there are many, many young people in the indigenous tradition who are continuing these indigenous traditions, but they have their elders with them, and these elders possess an energy, a power that enables them to do these dances for days on end without stopping. I was beyond amazed. Now, we have talked a little bit about this great god Quetzalcoatl, this alien visitor who ordered the people to do these terrible blood sacrifices. And now I want to switch very quickly to another being who was equally terrible. And so we'll go back to the time of Moses. And I will quote extensively from Christian and Barbara Joy O'Brien's book called The Genius of the Few. Let's start with the book of Exodus, and this is when the people first began to get an idea that their great God Yahweh maybe was not so friendly and fuzzy as they had first thought, because Yahweh states, "Whoever touches the mountain shall be put to death. No hand shall touch him, but he shall either be stoned or pierced through. Beast or man, he shall not live." Now remember, the people had been followed for a very long time by an aerial craft, the so-called pillar of fire and cloud that followed them wherever they went. And they had stopped in a particular place. They were told they had 3 days to rest, to wash their clothes, in preparation for their meeting with Yahweh. Until then, they had to rely on the second-hand and third-hand reports of this mysterious presence through Moses and their elders. Now, the setting for this dramatic meeting and the stage management of it must have been magnificent. Well-defined bounds had been set around the base of the mountain, which no one, man or beast, was to overstep on pain of instant death. The threats had started, and I had just read to you what that threat was, that they would be put to death. At that time, Moses was unfamiliar with Yahweh's long-range methods of killing, and could only think in terms of stones, spears, or arrows. He was to learn differently. At Horeb, the Israelites had their first taste of Yahweh's powers, the strictness of his orders, and the penalties for disobeying him. The mountain had probably been occupied by Yahweh as a base for a considerable time before the Israelites arrived, as a modern electrical fence is used to control cattle, so it might have had its own physical protection against intruders, also as Area 51 and some of the other underground bases that we've talked about have all sorts of motion detectors and cameras all set up so that if you just step 1 foot inside Area 51, immediately you are going to be surrounded by military or police vehicles. Now, a covenant was struck between Yahweh and quote-unquote his people, and Yahweh promised all sorts of wonderful things for them. Basically that the earth will produce fruits and crops and so forth. He will grant peace in the land, that the Israelites will not be troubled by anyone, that should anyone attack the Israelites, that they would be easily repelled. Yahweh says, I will look with favor upon you and make you fertile and multiply. That brings up interesting ideas and questions about genetic work. And he says, you shall eat grain long stored, and you shall have to clear out the old to make room for the new. I will establish my abode in your midst, and I will not spurn you. I will be ever present in your midst. I will be your God, and you shall be my people. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from the land of the Egyptians, to be their slaves no more, who broke the bars of your yoke and made you walk erect. Well, that sounds all wonderful and great, until you start to read the fine print, and you see what happens if you break this contract. Oops, here we go. Yahweh speaks, and if you remain hostile towards me and refuse to obey me, I will go on smiting you sevenfold for your sins. I will loose wild beasts against you, and they shall bereave you of your children, and wipe out your cattle. They shall decimate you, and your roads shall be deserted. And if these things fail to discipline you for me, and you remain hostile to me, I too will remain hostile to you. I in turn will smite you sevenfold for your sins. I will bring a sword against you to wreak vengeance for the covenant. And if you withdraw into your cities, I will send pestilence among you, and you shall be delivered into enemy hands. When I break your staff of bread, 10 women shall bake your bread in a single oven. They shall dole out your bread by weight, and though you eat it, you shall not be satisfied. But if despite this you disobey me and remain hostile to me, I will act against you in wrathful hostility. So that was just the beginning of what he would do. Just the very beginning of the consequences of breaking this covenant. He goes on, I for my part will discipline you sevenfold for your sins. You shall eat the flesh of your sons and the flesh of your daughters. I will destroy your places of cult and cut down your incense stands. I will heap your carcasses on your lifeless fetishes. I will spurn you. I will lay your cities in ruin and make your sanctuaries desolate, and I will not savor your pleasing odors. I will make the land desolate to you, so that your enemies who settle in it will be appalled by it, and you will scatter among the nations, and I will unleash the sword against you. Your land shall become a desolation, and your cities a ruin. Yes, it is possible that Yahweh was one of the quote-unquote shining ones, as spoken of in some ancient cuneiform text. But if he was, he probably was a renegade shining one, a monster, if you will, of the shining ones. So how many of you know that there is a description of Yahweh actually making an appearance in the Old Testament? Yes, I find this amazing. In the past, many years ago, I did read the Bible several times, but until I read this book by Christian and Barbara J. O'Brien, I didn't recall that Yahweh put in quite an appearance one day. Now, I am going to quote from the O'Briens. We visualize the high canvas wall of the east entrance to the courtyard being rolled back to reveal the entrance to the tent of meeting. As the hour approached, elders would have thronged the courtyard of the assembly, and the mass of ordinary people would have been in crowded ranks behind. At last Aaron raised his hand to still the mounting excitement, and he and Moses went into the tent of meeting, in which Yahweh was. The tension in the assembly must surely have been electrifying. At last they were to see, at close quarters, this Yahweh who seemed part prince, part warrior, part magician, and completely awesome being, who traveled in a quote-unquote cloud, trumpeted from the mountaintop, and laid down laws of a most exacting kind, and who promised so much prosperity in a barren land. This presence was shortly to appear in the doorway. What would they see? Had Moses and their leaders been able to convey any sense of the majesty and power of this being? In the event, the reality must have been more than the expectation. Certainly, the staging was superb. Moses and Aaron came out first, stepped aside, and held up their hands for silence. Yahweh appeared in the doorway, and this is directly from Leviticus 9:23 to 24. Quote, "And the presence of the Lord appeared to all the people. Fire came forth from before the Lord, and consumed the burnt offering and the fat parts on the altar. And all the people saw and shouted and fell on their faces." Unquote. This was a highly dramatic introduction to their Lord, who was not above using his technical superiority to hold the attentions of his subjects, or perhaps to cow them. But this was not all that was on Yahweh's agenda that day, as Joseph Farrell mentions in his great new book, Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men. He's the author of Babylon's Banksters and many incredible books. So, to go on quoting the O'Briens, although not described as such, there now appears to have been an interval in the drama. It was a memorable occasion, to be told and retold in the tents for many generations, and there may have been feasting and drinking with all, including Aaron's sons, joining in the celebration, and Yahweh must have been looking on, perhaps seated in the doorway to his tent. Let's go to Leviticus 10:1-2. Quote, "Now Aaron's sons." These are the sons of Aaron, a very, very special and important person. "Now Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, each took his fire pan, put fire in it, and laid incense on it. And they offered before the Lord alien fire, which he had not enjoined upon them. And fire came forth from the Lord and consumed them. Thus they died at the instance of their Lord." Unquote. Up till then, there had been threatenings of death, but these were the first recorded murders committed by Yahweh. There were to be many, many more. but we must be sure that we are justified in pronouncing murder. We must ask ourselves whether there could be any justification for the act. All the main translations basically say the exact same thing, that the fire came from the Lord and consumed them. And the chronicler assumed that it was a deliberate act. Had the sons of Aaron endangered Yahweh in some way? Or was the killing an act of uncontrolled anger such as Yahweh had warned Moses might happen? Quote, "If I were to go in your midst for one moment, I would destroy you." Unquote. Alternatively, was it a calculated act of execution carried out on two servants who had unwittingly stepped out of their place? A decision is not difficult to reach. Either alternative, by our norms, was completely unjustified, and in hindsight, after considering the other appalling actions which took place over the time span of the wandering in the desert, we are forced to pronounce quote-unquote murder, but we might add, quote, "while the balance of his mind was disturbed," unquote. Nadab and Abihu were trying to do honor to Yahweh by presenting him with the aroma of incense. Perhaps the flies were thick about him, and they sought to bring him some alleviation of the annoyance, but it was still murder. And those are the words of Christian and Barbara Joy O'Brien in their great book, The Genius of the Few. Buy this book and read it. Let's go to Numbers 16:26-35. Quote, "Move away from the tents of these wicked men, and touch nothing that belongs to them, lest you be wiped out for all their sins." Unquote. So they withdrew from the abodes of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Now Dathan and Abiram had come out, and they stood at the entrance of their tents, with their wives, their children, and their little ones. And Moses said, quote, "By this shall you know that it was the Lord who sent me to do all these things, that they are not of my devising. If these men die as all men do, if their lot be the common fate of all mankind, it was not the Lord who sent me. But if the Lord brings about something unheard of, so that the ground opens its mouth wide and swallows them with all that belongs to them, and they go down alive to Sheol, you shall know that these men have spurned their Lord." Scarcely had he finished speaking all these words, when the ground underneath them burst asunder, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up with their households. All Korah's people and all their possessions. They went down alive into Sheol, with all that belonged to them. The earth closed over them, and they vanished from the midst of the congregation. All Israel fled at their shrieks, for they said, quote, "The earth might swallow us," unquote. And a fire went forth from the Lord and consumed the 250 men offering the incense. What can we possibly make of this incredible narrative? The killing of 250 men was a form of execution which is becoming commonplace in this account, brought about by flames spurting from Yahweh, or more likely from some weapon which he held in his hand. This was not a bullet-laden gun, because he had used it to burn up the meat and fat on the range in a peaceable but dramatic demonstration of his powers. It was a weapon that generated intense and localized heat. Perhaps it was in the same category as the laser equipment which our own technology is now beginning to perfect. Yahweh appears to have been in possession of a weapon capable of exuding intense heat, possibly to the extent that localized vaporization occurred. It would follow that his aerial craft might have possessed an even more powerful weapon. If such had existed and had been used selectively to obliterate the families, the path of the beam might have left a furrow on the ground, which the stunned community might have convinced themselves later had been caused by the ground opening and closing. But whichever cause we attribute to the deaths, we are beginning to be sickened by the carnage apparently needed to correct a quote-unquote stiff-necked people who had little or no to say in formulating the covenant that they were being forced to observe. Indeed, the complete lack of feeling for the suffering of the innocent, wives, elderly people, and little children argues a monstrous megalomania such as has only been attributed to a handful of human leaders in the world's history. So what are we going to say about this? Now, in the past, in ufology studies, there has been an emphasis on Sumeria. Sitchin has done a great deal of work exploring the Sumerians and their barbarism, but very little has been said about the early Jewish people, the Israelites, and Yahweh. Perhaps that's because we come from a Judeo-Christian tradition, and a tradition of Judeo-Christian historians, archaeologists, anthropologists, and so on and so forth. But clearly the peoples of Mexico, the Aztecs, Mayans, Olmecs, Toltecs, and so forth, were clear game, because they were not Jews, nor were they Christians. So it is fair to describe them as being monstrous, and the Sumerians as being monstrous, but not until now are people finally coming clear and speaking about this monstrous extraterrestrial deity named Yahweh. We will end tonight's transmission here, and we will be in contact.